Hello, everybody. Really nice to see you. Hello. Sorry, I'm having a few issues just unmuting myself there. Hello. It'd be really nice just to hear in the chat if possible. It's nice to see lots of you joining. Just what your role is in school, what role you have. If you're working in school or when you might be starting English teaching, it'd be quite interesting to know. And just where you're joining us from would be really nice to hear in the chat if possible. So if you could just put into the chat what role you have in school at the moment and whether you're joining school soon and where you're joining from would be really great to hear. So I'm up near Liverpool, I'm up in the north of England. Be nice to see where you're all joining from. Just give it a couple of minutes while people are joining and we'll get started. So if you want to keep sharing in the chat sort of where you're from and what role you have in school, that would be really, really nice to hear. My name's Eleanor White. I'm a teacher educator. I've worked in schools for 14 years. And the latter half of my career has been teaching teachers. So in the teacher educator world, where I've been supporting secondary English teachers in the classroom. I had quite a few years before that in the classroom itself as a teacher and a leader, working as a middle leader and on senior leadership as well, leading literacy across school and mainly leading Key Stage 4 and 5 English. So lots of different experiences in different schools. So it's really lovely to see you all. Great that we've got someone from Dubai. Spent some time teaching in Dubai. It's really nice to have you here, and someone from India as well, which is brilliant. That's great to see. So keep those coming. It'd be really nice to know where you're joining from and what role you've got in your school at the moment. Would be really nice to hear from you. So we're going to think about putting our passion for English into practice, looking at some small steps, so lots of tangible takeaways today, thinking about small steps we can take to make a really big impact in our English classroom. And it's a practical guide that we're looking at, Enriching English and Pedagogy with Heart, a practical guide for new English teachers. So it's assuming you don't have a huge amount of experience in the classroom already. Brilliant. So lots of people joining. We've got lots of quite international guests on the call, which is great to hear. Really great that this book is getting an audience so far and wide. That's really exciting. So I thought I'd start by thinking about the book itself and the kind of philosophy and thinking behind it, the why behind the book. It's really nice to have this opportunity to speak to you about Enriching English Pedagogy with Heart. I thought I'd start with the why, sort of setting up context for the title and the content of the book itself so you can understand that thinking. So pedagogy, the pedagogue was somebody who guided young students to school in ancient Greece. So pedagogy is guidance, it's teaching practice, but it's guidance really. It's about frameworks, or as I call them in the book, schema, building up a bank of knowledge to increase access to quality education for all. And heart is really important, and that runs through the book as a key theme, this idea of love and passion for the subject itself. I think love and passion for your subject is the most driving force for really good quality teaching and memorable teachers as well. And this is underpinned by really robust and inspiring knowledge. I think knowledge is really important. And this can be your subject knowledge, so the text that you're teaching, all of the literary terms that you might teach, but also your knowledge of teaching itself, your pedagogical content knowledge, which this book really arms you with and gives you much more of an understanding of. So what we know about our subject and what we know about how to teach it is really important for this love and passion that we develop in our teaching. And this is reinforced and developed by professional development, which I explore in chapter 6. And most importantly, wellbeing. I think wellbeing sort of holds up all of the blocks of English and allows you to be as good a teacher as possible. So we're really thinking about the richness of English and enriching the subject itself. Thinking about this really unique and powerful subject that we're all really privileged to teach, um, and how it can be enriched. So let's have a little think about what's rich about English. What do we want to enrich through this pedagogy with heart that we will explore? So there's many reasons why English is rich, and I'm sure you're all on the same page with me, thinking about it as such a great subject to teach. I think richness comes in the ability of English to be a vehicle for personal growth. It's a subject that can have a profound impact on you as a teacher, but as a student as well. Your students will be having profound experiences within their classroom. And I'm sure we've all got texts or experiences from English that we still remember and stay with us. Because I can remember vividly doing a presentation when I was at school on Wuthering Heights, reciting poetry, doing dramatic productions of texts. Those experiences really stay with me as they will stay with you, as your experiences will stay with you. And it can really help us make sense of the world and other people and our place within it. I think English is a really powerful subject to teach because we learn through stories. So it's a really great subject that you can learn a lot through stories, which is a really important pedagogical technique, which the book explores. And it also makes it more memorable. As I said already, it sticks with you, English. And I think the kind of power of the story is really important as well. English is really important because if you do well in English, you do well in other subjects. It really supports and bolsters other subjects on the curriculum. It's important for access, which I've already mentioned, and it supports success across the curriculum, giving students the ability to succeed in all realms of life. So it's a really great subject to be a part of and to teach. It's also really important because we can sort of see ourselves reflected in the stories. The power of the story is so strong that we can see ourselves reflected in specific stories, and we can make sense of the world through that. We can see others reflected in the stories that we teach, and we also see new worlds and different contexts that we don't know, and we can make sense of those as well. So now might be a good time for you to just reflect on the power of English and why you love it so much. What is it about English that you really love? And if you'd like to share anything in the chat, that would be lovely to hear and to see. What is it about English that you really love? And in the book itself, in chapter 1, we have a little look at objectives and planning and setting objectives, and how it's quite helpful and useful, particularly for assessment, to phrase these as questions. So this is what we'll be exploring today. These are the questions I'd like to answer. So what is the key thinking behind the book? I've started to think about that already, but I'll continue to explore that with you. What are the frameworks or schema which underpin its chapters? And we're going to delve into those together. How will it support me in my development as an English teacher? And hopefully this is the one that you'll really understand and get the answer to as we move through the presentation today. Just gonna have a quick check of the chat. We've got lots of people joining from lots of different places. That's really, really great. Thank you so much for all your contributions. So it's a practical guide for new English teachers. It's filled with really tangible takeaways, so things you can really take and use the next day in your classroom to support you in your new classroom. It's very much for new teachers who don't have much of an experience of pedagogy. It's aimed at teachers who maybe don't quite know what pedagogy is yet and don't know how it kind of shows itself in the English classroom. I came to teaching, I had a literature degree, but I didn't know very much about pedagogy itself. And this book is a really great introduction to the kind of realm of pedagogy and thinking about the practice of teaching itself. A really great introduction to that. And there's lots of further reading. So every chapter has a nice reading list that gives you more information on the reading that you could do around each topic. So for instance, inspiring reading, there's lots about the scaffolded reading experience that you might want to go ahead and read. The craft of writing, we look at the writing sequence and different ways of building writing into lessons, and there's different suggested readings for you to take your learning further forward, which hopefully is quite useful. Pedagogy is a guidance, and it's very much a sort of a framework that's quite loose. It's something that changes quite a lot, and it changes with as adaptable teaching. We have adaptable teaching, and we like to change our approach for different scenarios and different topics, and it can alter between subjects. And we start looking at the power of pedagogy. So what's important about it, and why is it important to have this framework or this guidance to lead us through teaching? And then we look at the principles of English as I see them. So we'll delve into those in a moment, and we'll think about those, which underpin everything really within the classroom. Then we look at oracy in the classroom, because that's how we start to communicate. And we listen first. First thing babies will do is listen before they start to talk. Then into reading, then into writing. And then we think about professional development, so practically applying these skills with our mentor and how we might do that effectively. And then a really important cause, I think, and something really, really key that we need to think about throughout our teaching career is wellbeing, and that has its own chapter and lots of different strategies to take away to really look after ourselves and our well-being. And I think that really resonates with the title of the book and bringing in this heart and this love for the subject. We need to love and nourish ourselves as well as the subject itself to be the best teacher we can be. So it'd be really interesting now. I think we've got a poll coming up. I'd really love to know which chapter most intrigues you. So which one do you find most intriguing? And it can be any chapter you think. I'd really like to have a read of that. It'd be really interesting to see what you think. So out of the 7 chapters, which one most intrigues you? Just while you're doing that, there's some really lovely answers to what's so powerful about English within the classroom in the chat, which is really great to see, really rich and versatile. I love that word, versatile, and the idea of it being something that we can mould and change and use in different contexts and purposes. Definitely. We can paint pictures within our students' minds. I love that. It's a really lovely way of saying it. Maybe we're intrigued by inspiring reading. So hopefully it's nice to see what the chapters are, and to think about what might be this kind of most interesting chapter to us. It might be that you're intrigued by more than one. But yeah, they're the 7 chapters of the book itself. So let's have a look at this more visually. So as I've mentioned already, the pedagogue guided students. So it's a guidance. This pedagogy is a framework for us to teach. And chapter 1 sets that up, and I explore with the power of pedagogy what this guidance in English might be, thinking about planning and cognitive science and English. Oh, I've just had the results, but they disappeared. I just had the results. Oh, here we go. Brilliant. I think we've got a winner of inspiring reading. Seems to be something that everyone's really keen to find out more about. And I'm going to talk about inspiring reading in more detail later on. Also, writing has scored quite highly, which is great to see. But lots of intrigue for all the chapters there, which is brilliant to see. But reading seems to be the most popular, which doesn't surprise me actually. I think reading is often what we love most as English teachers. So I'll definitely delve into that in more detail slightly later on. So yeah, it's a unique subject, English, and we think about planning principles and cognitive science that works in English. So I don't think everything about cognitive science works perfectly well with English, but some of the strategies work really well, and we look at how those work together, like interleaving, together information and recall. English is a really unique subject, and we need to think about the principles that support it. And those are explored in the next chapter, in chapter 2. And they're at the bottom here because they underpin everything within English lessons, and they run through the book like a thread, each principle. You'll see it coming up again and again throughout the book itself. So I'll go into these in more detail, but they're things that work really well throughout all English lessons. But you'll actually see when I show you what they are, that they are things that might work in other subjects as well. And we can think about that link between literacy and developing language throughout all subjects. We can use these principles, but they're very much focused and talked about in the book in line with English and how it can be supported for English lessons. Heart is about morals, and it's about looking after yourself and your colleagues. So these principles underpin the 5 blocks of development for an English teacher, which set up the next and final 5 chapters. And these are oracy, reading, writing, professional development, or the practical application of skills, and wellbeing, a really important part of teaching, I think. So they're the kind of 5 blocks of English teaching. You very often might see sort of 3 strands of English, or see reading and writing, but I believe that this professional development and this nurturing of your wellbeing is just as important as those 3 things, 3 strands as well. So they're all given sort of equal weight and equal amount of exploration within the book itself. So these are underpinned by research, informed guidance, which forms a framework or a schema, as I call them, for the five blocks itself. So that's what the book looks like visually. So it might be a nice time to kind of think about any questions you might have on the structure of the book and how it all fits together. Just looking at that. So in chapter 1, I thought I'd give you some examples of what I explore and what's useful in each chapter. In chapter 1, I think about English and what we teach. And we teach knowledge, we teach facts, which is really important. And that can be kind of knowledge that's just based on one context, or knowledge that can be used across different topics. We teach skills, so what you can do, so things how you can manipulate language, how you can analyse, but also really importantly, how you feel and how you respond, I think is really a powerful part of English. And we explore these and we think about each of these 3 things as we teach new material in English lessons. So that kind of solace from reading a poem, the connection to a character, the joy of just reading is really important. And there's also some ideas about planning and how to kind of think about objectives for your lesson, but frame those as a question. So have a driving question for your lesson. What is it you want your students to do? What's the question you'd like them to answer? And a structure that's quite nice to follow, and there's a few different worked examples of this within chapter 1 and in later chapters as well. Kind of spark and recall, so give some time to spark new ideas and to be sort of excited by the new material. Introduce what the new material is, what we're going to do today, set a real focus for the lesson itself. Attempt, so have a go at what you're doing within the lesson. A really nice kind of phrase to be using. Let's have a go at, let's try this out. And really interesting that I think it's quite important to attempt before defining success criteria. So before making things really solidified as to what they need to look like, before looking at models, just to see what students can come up with. I'm going to look at in a moment how authenticity is really important within the English classroom. So that space to be creative is really, really helpful. So having an attempt, having a go, it doesn't have to be perfect. And it can be quite a short amount of time as well. Here it's just 5 minutes. Then compare, then have a look at a model, have a look at some success and see what that looks like and how it compares to what you've produced, how it might support you to define success criteria. Then collaborate, so working together. One of the principles is collaboration. So really helpful to kind of work together and produce something, focusing on that defined success criteria that we've defined together. And then create, have a time to innovate towards the end of the lesson. So have some time to apply all this new knowledge and create something. And all of this is underpinned and it weaves like a thread through the lesson with assessment and feedback. So swapping books, giving feedback in books, giving verbal feedback, questioning, peer assessment, all really important. So we look at that planning and how it can support our episodes of learning, which aren't always lessons. They can go over more than one lesson. An episode of learning can be quite a long period of time. So why champion the subject and discipline of English? What makes it such a unique and valuable subject? What I thought about when I thought about my vision for teaching, which kept me really focused when I worked in some difficult schools. It's about giving students sort of access, as I've mentioned before, access to drama, to debate, to discussion, to engagement with the world. And English is really about that seat at the table, so giving them that ability to engage with lots of other subjects and opportunities. But it's also really important as a subject of its own, of itself. And this kind of importance can be really reinforced by some subject-specific principles. And I think lots of these come from my memory and come from things I've seen from my training and from my work as a teacher educator and from my work as a leader in schools. And I think Aeschylus said in 424 BC that this was quite wise to use things that you've seen working that you remember. So the working principles that underpin the subject of English are here. I think the first one, collaboration, is really important. Having collaborative experiences, working together, jointly constructing something together, whether it's within talk or writing or maybe reading together. It's really important to work together and to develop that skill. You know, we're getting students ready for life beyond school. So it's really important to work together and collaborate. Scaffolds and models, they're giving students a look of what success is like. Thinking about modelling, again, that can be through talk or through writing or through reading. It can be through any of those strands of English. And the steps to get there, so the scaffolds that increase our chance to succeed. And the portion of the chapter that looks at scaffolds and models looks at how to sort of gradually take those away as well and take away the need for seeing a model, kind of being a little bit more creative. It's kind of linked to this authenticity and this ability to create and be innovative, and maybe not rely so much on scaffolds and think about gradually releasing that responsibility. Assessment is so important, so giving students clear and formative feedback at regular, timely intervals and allowing them to understand what success might be and what the next kind of step on the ladder might look like. Authenticity, I've mentioned it a few times. I think about being more creative, having more personal responses to text and how that might be able to happen, and there's different strategies for how to do that within the chapter. Really important to think critically, to have different interpretations, to give students that power to have an opinion and think about how to articulate their opinion clearly and how that can be done, and to explore ambiguity, which is really important part of English, is that ambiguous nature of things and how to be able to explore that well. I think all of this is underpinned and driven by questioning, really good questioning. I think questioning could be a book of its own. It's a really important skill, and there's a nice matrix in the chapter of questions that you can ask to support your teaching and to support thinking within English itself. So now I thought it might be quite nice to do an activity that's from the book. So the book's quite interactive and it's got specific activities at certain times, and it asks you to do things. And one of the things that we do with the principles of English is to rank them, to think about which one might be the most important, which one that we think is the most important. So I thought it might be nice to just have a go at thinking about what you think is the most important of the principles, and maybe just put in the chat what you think is a really key thing within teaching, within lessons. It might be nice to see what you think there. And we'll come back to these later in the session and explore if anything's changed. But if you wanted to just let me know which one you think is the most important. Great, thank you so much, Hugo. Really good. So, sort of think critically. I think that is really, really key. Really important thing. Yeah, I would probably go for questioning. I think questioning kind of envelops so much of our teaching and our ability to push and develop students' thinking, which is so important to get them thinking. Scaffolding also really important. Lots of different answers, really interesting to think that all of these are quite equally important. Yeah, questioning leads to everything, definitely. Lots of people keen on questioning. Collaboration, really, really important principle, I would say. Definitely. Thank you so much. So we'll come back to these and we'll think about them in a little bit more depth. But they are the principles that are outlined in chapter 2. So also in this chapter, activities that can support those principles, so you can use those principles in action. And this one is for collaboration, so working together. And it uses Palinsko and Brown's reciprocal teaching roles. So builds on reciprocal reading research that they wrote about in 1984. So having a predictor, a questioner, really important to have that questioning. Even though it's collaboration, it's developing a different principle as well. A clarifier and a summarizer. So you might be having some kind of debate on the Iliad maybe, and having some exploration of ideas there, and giving students their roles and specific things that they need to do can really support them to work together and to collaborate together. So that's one of the strategies, that's one of the resources that the book has. Another thing that's within every chapter actually is time for reflection. So time for you to reflect on what's been explored in each kind of portion of each chapter. So there's a bit of an exploration of creativity and authenticity and how to bring that out in students. And critical thinking that needs to be novel, self-directed and effective. But also the idea about diversity and having lots of different diverse texts and diverse experiences for students in the classroom. So they're explored together. And then there's this time for this reflection that gives you time to reflect and think about how it applies to you and how supportive it could be to your teaching. So they're the first 2 chapters that we've explored, so the power of pedagogy, thinking about planning and different aspects of pedagogy, and the principles of English that we've looked at and thought about. Now there's the 5 blocks of English teaching that I think are really important within our classroom, and we start with oracy, and then that goes to wellbeing. So I'm going to zoom in on each, but just before we have a look at each chapter, I'm just going to share with you a resource. It's adapted from Rose and his thinking about reading and talk and developing reading, talk and writing together. This is a kind of continuum, a sort of framework of moving from pre-reading, so read what we might do before we read whole texts, to short passages, into sentences, back again, zooming out, looking at the whole text to a reflection, thinking about the different strategies we might include. And each of the ones in bold are kind of elaborated on and given specific examples of how you might use those in the classroom itself. So going from the kind of pre-reading to the reflection on a text and what activities you might do through that. And this is how kind of oracy, reading and writing can overlap and can support one another within the classroom. So the next 3 chapters explore that. And the first one is on oracy. So something that I find takes the students I work with, the trainee teachers that I work with now, takes them quite a while to feel confident with this. It can feel quite scary to have talk in your classroom and to let students just discuss can be quite a scary thing. So it'd be really interesting to know how you feel about oracy instruction in your classroom. You might want to share something in the chat. How confident are you? What are the questions that you might have? Because it can be quite daunting, but it really is powerful, and it's really important to give students that time to listen, to engage in listening and to develop their listening skills, but also to develop that skills of presentation and collaboration through talk and discussion, which is really important. We've kind of lots of us have said that questioning is really important, and I think oracy is a really supportive medium for developing questioning within the classroom itself. So some key takeaways from the chapter. Oracy there's a schema for going through oracy itself. And some key takeaways are that we want to get students listening and talking. So using some of the research that I use is from Alexander and Mercer. So thinking about different strategies by using talk stems to support listening and talk, but also setting the ground rules that Mercer talks about. So making sure that things are explicit. So you might be sort of worried about behaviour within your classroom, and you might think about students might not be productively talking. And I think setting explicit ground rules is really supportive for that. And really, really helpful. Really helpful to kind of use a framework. So Voice 21 have a brilliant framework that there's an adaptation of within the book that can support you. And there's a reference to where that comes from, and you can have a look at their fantastic research on this. And think about just practicing. So using lots of different opportunities to practice the use of talk. I'm a real kind of advocate and really enjoy Socratic questioning and thinking about talking about talk. So talk about the quality of talk, and there's a structure and a takeaway for how to use specific Socratic questioning within the classroom. So you want to sort of develop drama and debate in a joyful classroom, and there's lots of different strategies and ways in to do that, kind of in a low stakes way to give students that opportunity to engage in listening and talk. One of the things the chapter really looks at is to support and scaffold listening. So there's lots of different scaffolds for listening, and this is one for A Midsummer Night's Dream. Some images, some Shakespearean words there, but also a kind of framework to follow for listening, understanding the goal, reflecting, summarising, sharing and clarifying. So a matrix for listening. And again, there's lots of time for reflection. So building on what Robin Alexander, who talks about dialogic classrooms, and Mercer, who talks lots about exploratory talk, what they talk about in their ground rules, which you might reflect on, but also making sure that talk is collective, reciprocal, supportive, cumulative, and purposeful. And there's different strategies for how you might do that within the classroom. And then this is built on Voice 21's oracy framework. So a kind of success criteria and assessment tool for you to use, different questions to use for different aspects of talk that can really support with kind of assessing talk and giving students time to kind of peer assess and assess together. So then that's oracy. So then we move on to reading. I think lots of us were really intrigued by this chapter and were quite interested to know what would be in it. So let's delve in. I think reading for pleasure is the key research that I build on and look at lots of ideas for reading for pleasure. And it can support all reading in the classroom, and it can really inform our approach to reading in the classroom itself. It can be pleasurable in the classroom as well as outside the classroom. I build a lot on what Graves and Graves talk about in the scaffolded reading experience, but also just think about immersing students in the story and thinking about just reading for the enjoyment of reading, and thinking about scaffolding after the read. So it's quite important to have a knowledge of how students decode and how they use their visual spatial memory, and how that can support the development of their imagination. And that's all really helpful, and we can use that knowledge to support us to scaffold what they've read, and try to avoid those rigid structures. So, you know, I did it myself when I worked in schools, but using things, acronyms like PEAL and PETAL, and using those kind of things can take away that authenticity that we looked at earlier and we look at here. Thinking about maybe using scaffolding to drive analytical, using questioning, sorry, to scaffold and drive analytical responses. So questions that drive analysis is really, really helpful. And there's lots of different drama activities for reading within the chapter. Thinking about how to bring drama to your classroom to support the read. And that can be, there's lots of writing on this slide, so I wouldn't expect you to digest all of that, but it can be through some improvisation. So thinking about characters and how they might act in different ways based on different things. The given circumstances can really support context. So thinking about what do we know about this character at this point of time, and what might we infer about them. Flashback, flash forward, thinking about different characters at different stages in the play and how different actions throughout the play affect their behaviour. And thought tracking as well, thinking about how characters might be thinking beyond what they say in the scene itself. So lots of different ideas and different strategies for reading. And then we move on to writing. Think about how to support development of a believable voice in writing, and authenticity, again, that creativity, thinking about drafting, modelling and thinking like a writer. Think about the nuance of writing, so how we bring in that collaboration again and that discussion of how writing is important, and that self-regulation as well, of developing thought of how writing can be improved and how it's supportive through metacognition. And there's different strategies for that. There's a matrix for how to support writing. And we also look, as I mentioned earlier, and this is in chapter 2, but also reinforced in chapter 5, sort of gradually removing scaffolds, how that can be done well. And there's some ideas of activities for sort of idea capture. So making ideas as clear as possible, thinking about arguments and what we agree with, what we disagree with, and capturing these ideas that students might have and supporting them and structuring them in response to a statement and ways that you might do that, building an argument. And really important, really quite difficult skill, but quite important and quite helpful, is to live model, to think about modelling for students and how to articulate the thought process when you're modelling. So thinking about articulating what the writer might be going through, what they might be thinking as they're writing. So there's a few worked examples of that for you to support you. So there are the 3 main strands of English. So now at the end of the book, there's just 2 more chapters that look at professional development and wellbeing. So professional development is really important, and we look at this as a practical application. So looking at a practical application of skills. So this is my term for deliberate practice that you might have heard of. There's lots of research on deliberate practice in classrooms, but it's all very kind of generic, not subject specific. So this chapter is very English specific. So how does it work within English as a subject? And it builds on the principles of chapter 2. So using those specific principles, how can we develop a subject specific approach to coaching in the classroom? And there's a tool for reflection as well that we'll look at in a second, that really supports you to give you more perspective. But this is the framework for practical application. So thinking about pinpointing the highest leverage action step, thinking about deciding what's going to make the biggest change in your classroom, and it'll be your mentor who does that, whoever's supporting you. Your teacher trainer or your mentor will select that highest leverage action step. And then isolating that skill and thinking about the research that supports it. So you might have a lot of writing in your classroom that doesn't have much creativity or much of a personal, believable voice. So you decide, or your mentor decides that it'd be really good if you had some talk before writing, you had some discussion and some idea capture, maybe in the form of a debate through oracy, and you might look at some of what Mercer says about laying the ground rules for that and how to do that effectively. Then your mentor would model how to do that. You might even go to one of their lessons and watch them do it in real time with a real group. They can also model within your meeting how to set it up. And then you practice in your lessons and you take that away and you think about enacting some use of debate and developing these ground rules within your classroom. And then you reflect using the reflection tool that we'll have a look at in a second. And then at the end, you kind of think, what did the research say? What did it tell us about this practice or this pedagogy? And then does it live up to reality? What's happened in reality? And what's the mental model for this pedagogy? You can reflect together. And reflection is always good when you look through different lenses. So thinking about different eyes. So what was the event? What happened? They were all talking while I wanted them off topic, while I wanted them to discuss the work. You know, how does that manifest itself through my eyes? How were my students feeling? What did they say? What were their reflections? What might somebody who works in my school, a colleague, might say? Someone external, someone who's not within the context, why might they think differently? What could it be that they've seen? And what does research say? And does that all align? Does that all support your reflection, and does that support you moving forward? So all this adapted from Brookfield is in the chapter and gives you that support to reflect. So final chapter is on wellbeing, supporting yourself, loving, nourishing yourself to support your teaching. I think the love and the richness of English comes through an acknowledgement of what we need for our wellbeing. It's really, really important, often forgotten, but it needs to be top of your to-do list. I definitely went through a period when working in schools where I forgot about wellbeing and I didn't prioritise it, and I really suffered because of that, and it's really difficult. There's a tool in the book, the 5 whys, to get to the root of a problem. So to really figure out what it is that's going wrong and to support you in eradicating issues and solving problems to support your wellbeing. Just ensuring that wellbeing is seen as one of the blocks of English is really important to make you a much better teacher. And there's a framework in the form of a journal to support you with the organisation and the prioritisation of this. And there's a nice meditation. So it might be nice to just reflect on the power of wellbeing and why that's important to you. You can just reflect on your own, or you can share anything in the chat if you'd like to. So just a quick reminder of the structure of the book. And I'm going to pause now for any questions at all that have come in. If there's any questions, please do.
Thank you, Eleanor, for the presentation. I think that was really useful. Hopefully everyone who's joined the call today has got lots of tips that they can take back into the classroom. So I've just popped up to chair this Q&A and to put any of the questions to Ellie. So I see we've got one already in the Q&A. Feel free to keep on putting them in. There's no such thing as a bad question. So please, if you do have any thoughts, anything that you'd like to ask before we log off today, please feel free to put those questions into the chat or the Q&A, which also I believe has an anonymous function if you'd rather keep your name private. But I'll start off with the question that we do have at the moment. And And that question is, does the plan structure, which I think you covered just before the oracy section, does the plan structure cover a series of lessons or apply to a single lesson?
So yeah, it can be both, to be honest. It can. I always think that a lesson isn't the best way to think of a unit of learning because students can learn beyond one lesson itself. They can make progress over more than one objective in one lesson, or it can take a few lessons to develop towards an objective. So I would say that the examples are used are kind of one lesson themselves, but there's also an example of how you might use it kind of over a series of lessons, so a scheme of work as well. So you can use that structure throughout more than one lesson over a series of lessons as well as one lesson itself.
Great. Thanks for clearing that up. Hopefully that makes sense to the person who's asking that question. I can see in the chat lots of people just saying thank you for the session. So that's great. I'm really glad you guys have all enjoyed it. I think we've got time for a few more questions, so we'll keep going. I just wanted to go back to the point you were making earlier about Socratic questioning. Now, I'm personally a former classics student, so I have an idea of what you're talking about there. But if there's anyone on the chat who's not really sure what that means, if you could just explain a little further, what does it mean to use Socratic questioning as a model when you're thinking about oracy in the classroom?
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up actually, because it was something I mentioned and I thought, oh dear, I haven't really explained that in a lot of detail. And there's a worked example in the book that gives you kind of steps of how you might use it within the classroom. But it's essentially having a circle of students who are involved in some kind of discussion or debate that's structured with specific questions. And then you've got an outer circle of students who observe and evaluate that talk, and they think about how productive and how effective the talk was, so that it's quite sort of metacognitive, and they think about how successful the talk is of the kind of main body of students. So it's talk about talk and talk about the quality of talk in the classroom.
Thank you. That's really useful. I'm sure that will clear it up for anyone who was unsure as to what Socratic questioning was and how to use it in the classroom. We'll keep going. I wanted to ask as well, what really inspired you to write this book? Why did you think you needed to put these ideas down into this handy little guide for new teachers?
I think, I kind of came to English teaching with not very much knowledge of like the practice of teaching itself. And I think I've learned a lot, and I've met a lot of people, and I've worked with a lot of really interesting, engaging people who've given me lots of amazing ideas. And I just felt like it would be great for new teachers to have a structured practical guide of all the things I've learned and all the things that have really supported me in the classroom. So I think it was kind of from my own experience of kind of not having that, and not knowing quite what pedagogy was, or quite what it looked like in the English classroom, or why English was so unique, and what it is about English that we can support students with, and sort of filling that gap really.
Oh, that's great. Hopefully, this will really help that next generation of teachers who are going into schools now. We've got another question has just come through in the Q&A, so I'll ask that now. What pedagogy or strategy has made the most impact on your students in the classroom, if you can possibly rank them in that way?
Yeah, I think there's so many different techniques and so many things you can do within English classes that really support development of students' thinking. I think student thinking is so important, and I think that can be done really well. And I think what I've seen to be the most powerful thing in my classroom is debate. So allowing students to engage in debate, and there's a few strategies in the book of how to set that up and how to teach them the different kind of regulations and ideas around debates and how debates work in the classroom, and it just really kind of accelerates their thinking, and giving them some kind of cognitive conflict, so some kind of kind of play devil's advocate and give them something to alter the line of their viewpoint or their thoughts, to really sort of challenge them and give them time to think has been really helpful. So yeah, I think including debate in the classroom, and lots of the sort of research that I touched upon by Mercer really supports setting that up and making that as fruitful and purposeful as possible.
Thank you for that question and debate. That's what we'll need to remember. Um, we have another question here. I was wondering, you've obviously spoken about how, you saw that when you started teaching, you had lots of questions that weren't necessarily being answered. And I was wondering if you could kind of go back in time and speak to yourself as a early careers teacher, as a trainee. What's one thing that you would say to that young teacher?
I think one thing, I think sort of keep it simple. Just keep it really simple. It's you want students to be able to think and develop their thought processes. And you can do that with very simple frameworks that work really well. And people have been teaching for centuries, for, it's one of the oldest professions. And I think um, we naturally want to learn, and and I think you can get quite bogged down early in your career with maybe bad behavior, or you know you want your classroom to be perfect, and you want the PowerPoint to be perfect. And I think just keeping it as simple as possible, and just relying, each chapter in this book has a framework that works for each strand of English, and just rely on that framework and think about how you can keep it as simple as possible. I think would be my best piece of advice.
Great. Thank you for that. I think we've got time for just a couple more questions. So if anyone does have any other thoughts they want to put in the chat or into the Q&A, you're more than welcome to. But in the meantime, I wanted to ask another question. And that is, what do you think are the biggest challenges teachers are facing at the moment? What are you seeing with the teachers that you're training? What are the problems that they're facing when they're going into the classroom?
I think at the moment there's just so I think workload is really heavy. I think there's a lot that teachers are asked to do. And I think a heavy workload is really difficult, and teachers are just very tired, and they have very limited time for everything they need to do. And a lot of the teachers that I train are doing assignments on the side of their teaching, and sort of teaching and preparing for lessons is a huge full-time job that's really, really cumbersome anyway. And then very often when you're training, you've got essays to write as well. So I think workload is a massive, massive issue. And there's lots in chapter 7, in the final chapter, there's lots of ideas of how to kind of manage your priorities and think about how to prioritize things, and things that you could eradicate that aren't going to be helpful to you, and things that might um you can just not do, or you can maybe delegate some things, and also just how to nurture the love of what you're doing as well, to keep you motivated, because I think very often when you've got heavy workloads and lots of priorities sort of on your shoulders, it can feel very difficult to be motivated. So to kind of keep motivated is really important.
Great, thank you for that answer. We've got one more question in the Q&A, and then I'll hand back to you just to wrap up and share those summary slides with everyone. And that question is, how do you inspire reading in the first class? And I think this might mean, as in, like sort of year 7, or
Okay.
students who are just starting secondary school, perhaps.
Yeah. I think really leveraging that power of the story. So thinking about that real power that we all have, um, that we all kind of really, really respond really well to, of what's going to happen, what is going to happen in this story. And I think it's why we read, it's why we read fiction. It's why we watch a lot of drama on the television, is because we're dying to know how that story ends and how it goes. And I think really leveraging that power and that idea of setting up the story for students in sort of the early years, maybe in year 7, of these are the characters, this is the setting, this is the problem, this is the kind of thing that's that's happening for them. What do you think is going to happen? And in chapter 3, there's lots of chapter 4, sorry, there's lots of examples of how to kind of predict what might happen next and how to support that prediction, and to really leverage that excitement of the story, I think is the best way to develop that keenness to read.
Okay, thank you. I think that's probably all the time we have for now for questions. So I'm going to hand back to Ellie just to finish off her presentation and sum up everything that she's been talking about today. But thank you everyone for listening to that, and I'll take myself back off camera.
Thank you. So yeah, to go back to those principles that we looked at earlier, and we thought about which ones were the most important. And maybe you're thinking about ones that maybe you haven't considered before, and maybe they could be quite helpful to you as you think about teaching in the classroom. So these were the objectives that I set. These are the questions, the driving questions for the seminar, for the webinar, sorry. So what's the key thinking behind the book? So hopefully you've had a real kind of flavour of that, and you really understand what this book is about and where it's come from. What are the frameworks or schema which underpin the chapters? Hopefully that's been made really clear to you. And how will it support you in your development as an English teacher? And hopefully that's really clear. And any feedback on how you feel about any of those questions would be really nice to see in the chat. Anything more you'd like to know, or anything that's been clarified for you, would be really great to hear. So thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to spend the last hour with you and talk about my new book that's just come out. It's really nice to sort of talk about it and sort of talk about all the strategies that I've included in there, and hopefully you'll find it useful, and you'll be able to enact some of those ideas, and they'll work well for you within your classroom. Just small steps that make a really big impact in the classroom. It's all been thought out as sort of well as possible for new teachers to really support you to make the best of what can be quite a challenging role. We kind of spoke about that earlier, what's difficult, what's facing teachers at the moment, and things are quite difficult within schools, but this book is hopefully there to really support you as a guide, as guidance, to really support quality teaching within your classroom that works really well. So thank you so much. It's been really lovely to spend this time with you. Really great to hear that you've enjoyed the session. Thank you so much. Thank you, Hugo. Thank you, Jade. Thanks for all of your responses. And have a lovely evening.